What is today Latin America was once many native nations. Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Dutch and Danish all invaded. They carried out genocide after genocide and enslaved both natives and Africans. After independence, most new native governments were still white dominated, with more genocides against natives in nations like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. European powers hold on to some territories even today and kept invading to take their colonies back. The United States invaded too, overthrowing or trying to overthrow over 60 governments, the last attempt in the year 2020 in Venezuela. The U.S. also took half of Mexico's land and a tenth of its people, then Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. There's a long history of many Americans fearing and hating Latinos. Latin America's image and reality is often one of instability, poverty, drug cartels, revolutions, corruption, and refugees. But it did not have to be this way. Latin America could remain all or mostly native nations. I spoke about this in detail in the previous series, What If Natives Won? Poverty, white domination, and foreign invasions could have been stopped, prevented, or limited. The U.S. could have been more Latino culturally, with higher numbers of Latinos. The U.S. could have been less racist, less dominating, or the U.S. could be defeated. Some Latin American nations could even become regional or world powers. There's a huge lack of alternate history about Latin America and Latinos. So much alternate history is Europe-centered, mostly because so much history and history teaching is Europe-centered. This series is dedicated to scenarios, points of departure, and possibilities of Latin American victory within Latin America and a more Latino or less racist American society. My name is Al Carroll. I'm Associate Professor of History at Northern Virginia Community College. I've written mostly about wars, veterans, human rights, and genocide. My next history book will be Genocide Denial in America, about the 7 genocides against indigenous people that took place in the U.S. that most people were never taught about, don't know, or deny. I've also written some science fiction, mostly alternate history. One story, Timely Saviors, appeared in a short story collection, The Witness Paradox. I'm also, together with Rob Schmidt of Bluecorn Comics, editing and putting it out a short story alternate history collection, What If Natives Won? I've also written a sci-fi alternate history book, The Man in Black, the first of a series. When the Spanish-American War ended, America had its first formal colonial empire, as bad as the empire they'd broken away from. Yes, the U.S. committed genocide in California, and then cultural genocide after conquest. The U.S. also had taken half of Mexico and a tenth of its people by force. They'd also replaced the indigenous Native and Mexican peoples with white colonists. Then thousands of American colonists stole land from individual Mexicans by deceptive land titles and stole homelands from hundreds of native nations. But U.S. territories were different. Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines for 50 years, Hawaii, and later the Virgin Islands, Samoa, and the Panama Canal Zone were all taken to be strategic military bases, mostly. Hawaii and Panama also offered a lot of profit. They were also all seized from people who weren't white. Though they claimed to be doing so for the good of these peoples, American racism couldn't have been more obvious. The Supreme Court even ruled they were, quote, alien races and incapable of understanding Anglo-Saxon law. None of them were ever intended to become states or have any rights at all, especially voting. Except for Hawaii, all of them are still colonies with no congressmen and can't vote in national elections. Different also for the Philippines, who suffered through a brutal 3-year war that killed 200,000 Filipinos by starvation, massacres, concentration camps, and torture. One U.S. general even gave an infamous order, kill everyone over 10. The U.S. kept the islands colonized for 50 more years, with forced assimilation programs much like aimed at natives. Some Filipino guerrillas kept fighting for almost 40 more years. Many Americans didn't agree with any of this, almost half of the public. Blacks, Latinos, and natives all opposed the war, but most of them couldn't vote themselves. Soldiers from all 3 groups often deserted, refused to go to the war, or even join the Filipino rebels. The labor unions and most Christian churches also opposed the war and the new empire. The Anti-Imperialist League led the opposition. The leaders were all very elderly men, mostly former abolitionists. Several of the leaders met with President McKinley, trying to convince him to give up control of these aspiring nations. McKinley dismissed them as frail old men who were out of touch. This league had dozens of prominent figures. If several of them more forceful had met with McKinley, the outcome might be different. McKinley felt he was pushed into the war by an angry public, manipulated by the yellow press. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer controlled almost every paper in the country, and their propaganda was the greatest cause of the war. McKinley described praying for guidance because he felt he wasn't getting it. Instead, he and the public discourse found themselves dominated by warmongers and paternalistic racists like Teddy Roosevelt. If League leaders like Andrew Carnegie, one of the most forceful figures in America, or Mark Twain, one of the most eloquent Americans ever, were sent instead of the League leaders, McKinley might have been swayed. The U.S. will then commit to leave. There will be no U.S. colonies. There will perhaps be protectorates, but there will almost certainly be economic U.S. domination, even sometimes American invasions. As discussed last video, if Cuba had not been U.S. dominated, Cubans would be far better off. One of the first things the U.S. government did was force out all the Afro-Cuban generals who led Cuba's army. Then they invited Spanish civilians back, gave them back the plantations seized by Cuban workers, and encouraged Spanish immigration to whiten Cuba's population. The U.S. then set property requirements to vote, so only 5% of all Cubans were allowed to vote. In 5 years, 60% of Cuban farmland was owned by Americans, and only 25% by Cubans. U.S. troops directly ruled Cuba in 1898, from 1906 to 1909, again in 1912, and then from 1917 to 1933. And the U.S. government had indirect control of Cuba all the way until 1959, when Castro won. Ideally, the U.S. has Cuba as a protectorate, with a base in Guantanamo or Havana or both. In our own time, Cuba's government was corrupt, elitist, and deeply racist. Black Cubans tried to revolt, lost, and then even seeking civil rights was made illegal. But without the U.S. whitening Cuba's army, and then the entire nation, and blocking black Cuban and poor Cuban votes, average Cubans are represented and have land. Cuba's early history will be much like Mexico's history after the Mexican Revolution. It still has corruption, and sometimes brutality. But it is by Cubans, not Americans or American puppets, and the average Cuban life is better, freer, and more prosperous. Would Castro then ever come to power? Would Batista even come to power? Or would he turn away from being a reformer to a brutal dictator? If Castro is not Cuba's leader, the world is very different. Apartheid in South Africa may last longer, since Cubans helped liberate it, Namibia, and Angola. Florida is certainly very different without Cuban exiles, and so are some American elections. Puerto Rico also would be independent. Puerto Rico actually was given autonomy briefly by Spain. When the U.S. invaded, it began an Americanization program. Marriage and divorce were taken away from the Catholic Church. The U.S. tried but failed to force English onto its people. The U.S. controlled the military and the economy, and 85% of manufacturing and over half the land was owned by new American outsiders. Obviously, with independence, none of this, or at least less of it, happens. In 1917, U.S. citizenship was imposed on Puerto Ricans without their consent. Independent supporters were first ignored and then kicked out of government on the island altogether in the 1920s. In 1937, in the city of Ponce, there was a massacre of independence demonstrators. In 1948, the island passed a gag law. This forbid the speaking or writing in favor of independence. And all of this was legal since the U.S. Constitution doesn't apply in U.S. territories, and neither do many American laws, even the minimum wage sometimes. Not only would any of these not happen, you still might have American companies still trying to exploit local labor, but sometimes you would still see American invasions. Worst of all in Puerto Rico was that from 1937 to 1974, the forced sterilization by a board of eugenics of 160,000 Puerto Rican women, or 1 out of 3. It's the world's highest rate of sterilization, at an average age of only 26. Some hospitals required it after the 3rd birth. Puerto Rican women were argued to be, quote, hyperfertile and burdens. And no one was punished for forced sterilization, though legally it is genocide. Most Americans don't know about it, and history classes rarely teach it. Under an independent Puerto Rico, this mass sterilization doesn't happen. The Puerto Rican population is much higher, perhaps double. This probably will drive some people overseas for work, and the poverty rate may go up. In our own time, Puerto Rican nationalists carried out revolts in the 1930s, 1950s, and 1970s. In 1950, there was an assassination attempt on Truman. In 1954, there was a terrorist attack on the U.S. Congress. In the 1970s, there were pro-independence bombings and bank robberies from groups like the Macheteros. If Puerto Rico is independent, this is never necessary, or it is directed against American invasions. Both government repression and economic dependence made support for Puerto Rican independence drop from very high to under 10%, where it is today. In the 1940s and 80s, the FBI had campaigns against the unions and independence activists. In 1992, it was revealed the U.S. government had files on 135,000 Puerto Ricans, about 1 out of every 20 adults. From the 1950s on, those on the mainland outnumber those on the island. Puerto Rico is so economically dependent on money sent back from the mainland, and all of this adds up to make independence far less popular. Puerto Ricans today are only allowed to vote in primaries. It has a population greater than 20 American states. Statehood has been repeatedly blocked by confused referendums and by Republicans in Congress, knowing the island probably will vote Democratic. Half of Americans even think Puerto Rico is a foreign country. That, plus Trump's incompetence and racism, is why hurricane relief was delayed and killing over 4,000 people. Under independence, there would be far fewer hurricane deaths. Nearby Cuba has very low deaths from hurricanes, even though it is a poor nation. All of these change if Puerto Rico is its own nation. There will be no forced sterilization, no gag law, no killing demonstrators, and no forced Americanization. There will even be less debt without direct U.S. control. There will be far fewer Puerto Ricans in the U.S. Spanish Harlem in New York doesn't exist, and a long list of Puerto Rican entertainers only tour the U.S. from their home country. Puerto Ricans are only likely to have come as immigrants to the U.S. in large numbers at about the same time as Dominicans, starting in the late 1960s. An independent Puerto Rico is most likely to be like its neighbor, the Dominican Republic. At times, it is democratic. At other times, it has had U.S.-supported dictators. If the U.S. doesn't declare it a protectorate, it is possible other nations could have invaded it. The most likely, Germany or Britain. If it was Germany, Germany would lose it during World War I. If Britain had taken it, Puerto Rico would become independent in the 1960s, much like Jamaica. Again, a side effect of all of these means that Hawaii likely becomes an independent nation again. American plantation owners had taken over by force. The American public and president had refused to make it part of the U.S. Not until the war, till the Spanish-American War, did public opinion change. Without that war hysteria, the plantation owners will fall to a rebellion by Native Hawaiians and Asian plantation workers. There will also be the independent Philippines much earlier. Filipino rebels had already kicked Spain out of the entire country except the capital. Then American troops invaded, betrayed the Filipino allies, and conquered with great brutality, killing at least 200,000, many in massacres. All of that would be avoided. The Philippines gained independence on their own in late 1898. It probably will be American economically dominated or manipulated, but it will never be an American colony. Guam also would have been independent, likely Japan seized it from Spain in World War II or during the Spanish Civil War. It becomes a U.S. trust territory after the war. Like those other trust territories, it gains independence in the 1980s, and it will be renamed, as many independence activists refer to it by the name Guahan, not Guam. Any one of these early independence means, well, as for Cuba, an early independence means no Castro is Cuba's ruler. He may be a noisy, eloquent senator in Cuba's Congress. That may also mean apartheid in South Africa lasting longer, since Cubans helped liberate it, Namibia, and Angola. and Florida is different without Cuban exiles, and so are American elections. There is an outside chance Puerto Rico could have had a revolution as radical as Cuba's. It would need someone who was just as skilled a leader, who would be just as radical, just as nationalistic, but also just as pragmatic, and able to build coalitions. None of the better known Puerto Rican leaders in our own time seems likely to be a Castro figure. None of them have had any success in building coalitions or building popular support for independence or holding on to it. None of the Puerto Rican terrorists, certainly, none of them show any skill as guerrilla leaders. This is the end of the video. Please repost freely, like, quote, and comment. This has been Latin American Victory. Next time we will discuss what if South Texas is anarchist.